Got your hand on a button down. Showing off. You've got your hand on a button now.
Testing. If you are a speaker or a moderator, would you please report to the stage?
Can I get some audio? Hi, my name's Brett Solomon. I'm the Executive Director of Access Now. It's a super pleasure to be here, and in fact, there is something quite special about to happen in the sense that we have Senator Ron Wyden here, who's just been speaking at the Crypto Summit. Senator, where are you? Outside. We almost have him here. Does somebody want to grab him? So I can introduce him? Or not? Thank you. I did just walk down with him, so how's everyone doing? Okay, good. Thanks, Kevin.
Sorry about that. The dangers of being prominent.
I'm not even going to introduce the senator. I'm just going to hand straight over to one of the legends of the internet, somebody who's protected the space in which we all operate, particularly within the US jurisdiction. So, Senator, over to you.
Oh, thank you. I was told that you were hoping I'd talk for an hour, 90 minutes. They think I'm serious, longer. I'm not going to do that. I very much appreciate your having me, and let me get right to this. I want to tell you, first of all, I am going to use every United States Senator to block any plan that would weaken strong encryption. And I'm going to tell you here in the next few minutes why I think the FBI director's plans and expected legislation are a lose-lose. They are going to lead to less security and less liberty. And I'm going to ask you this afternoon to join me in offering an alternative, which I've been calling a new compact for security and liberty. And I want to be clear at the start of this debate that data security is not about choosing security or choosing privacy. It is about choosing less security or choosing more security. People who think the government should have more surveillance powers are often going to try to frame this debate as a choice between privacy and security. They are wrong, and I believe it's our job to convince the public that when politicians or people in the news media, and I can't tell you how many stories I've seen in the last few days that say in the ongoing fight between privacy and security, yada, 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 we are here as advocates to make it clear it is not about privacy versus security. It is about security versus more security. And that is what I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about. Now, we know the pattern. After virtually every tragedy, too many politicians and high-ranking intelligence officials say they've got to have more powers because new invasions of our private spaces are needed to keep us safe. That overreach led to secret mass surveillance under the Patriot Act. It's led to warrantless searches for Americans' emails and the current fight to weaken encryption, obviously far from over. Secret surveillance, secret mass surveillance was shown to be a loser. Warrantless email searches will be proven to be a loser. And I will tell you, plans to weaken strong encryption will be a double loser. I respect our law enforcement officers. I want them to have the tools they need to do their jobs. But I am going to oppose efforts to undermine the privacy and security of our people. So for purposes of my comments, I'd like to refocus the debate on how to have policies that are a win-win, that produce more security and more liberty. And I'll tell you about how to get there, but here are the challenges. First, I hope that all of you will try to explain to the politicians today's threats to privacy are unlike anything we have ever seen before. The centuries-old technological limits that stop governments from gathering real-time personal information about the whole population of a country are gone. The physical limits on government power have basically disappeared. Bruce Schneier calls our era the golden age of surveillance. So it's my view, outdated laws and precedents combined with advances in technology have given government agencies a greater ability to peer into the private lives of our people than ever before. And despite what the FBI director says about going dark, on balance, government agencies' surveillance capabilities are at an all-time high. with all of the internet-connected devices on our persons and our homes, for most Americans, there's literally nowhere where the government isn't capable of reaching. There are very few places where you can expect real privacy, not even some of our most personal spaces. Even our very thoughts often end up recorded on the technology we carry. So for centuries, individual liberty was protected because of these technological, limitations. And it would have required more resources than a government could muster. A few repressive regimes like East Germany and the Soviet Union tried. They spent the time and effort to build the sprawling networks of spies and informants to monitor their citizens. And it was almost an understanding of this authoritarian impulse within governments and the inevitability of technological change that made George Orwell issue his warning in 1984. Well, let me tell you, 70 years later, technology has caught up with Orwell's imagination. Your television screen can watch you, along with more and more gadgets that we wear, carry, or live with every day. Governments around the world have the technological capability to collect files on every single person in a way that would put the Stasi's work to shame. Our laws, of course, the courts, our laws, our whole system of government was designed by the founders to protect individual liberty from the power of the state. The founders understood that power shouldn't be trusted. They wove checks and balances into the power of the state into the fabric of our institutions. And they relied on the physical limits on the state's power for the times when institutions failed. Now, physical limits disappeared. Our country's got to stay true to the founders' intent and come up with new laws and new precedents so that individual liberty is guaranteed by more than just the goodwill of men and women in power. So it is now technologically possible for the state to irretrievably encroach on freedoms, fundamental freedoms, including freedom of expression and free association and privacy. And as I lay out the alternative, I want to be clear. I'm not accusing government officials of deliberately setting out to restrict Americans' rights. If you think about their jobs, it makes sense that law enforcement and intelligence officials want access to the most information about the most people with the least hassle and inconvenience. What they do is important. But my bottom line is I believe security without liberty is not a choice a free people will make. Now, fortunately, in our country, the FBI director doesn't get to decide the rules for searching your phone, and the NSA director doesn't get to write the rules for reading your emails. Our founders made sure of that. It is the responsibility of elected officials to write new rules that protect individual security and liberty against encroachment, and it's the responsibility of judges to question any increase in government power and ensure that the protections of the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, which will increasingly be a part of this debate, are as real as the day the Constitution was drafted. In this case, the rapid advances in technology over the last 20 years, in my view, threaten the rights of every single American more immediately and more personally than most Americans fully understand. And one of the reasons I want to come today, there's a lot going on in my home state, is I'm depending on persons like you who understand what this threat's about. Every one of you here today to spell out the dangers to the rest of the country. Now, your opponents are going to talk about going dark and letting terrorists win. And I think it's important in light of all this talk about the spread of encryption as some sort of national catastrophe to step back and look at the situation in perspective. Critics of encryption have suggested that those of us who believe that American consumers' devices should be as secure as possible, we are absolutists who have taken a position that is so dangerous that it's not sustainable. And just for a quick minute, I want to compare this discussion to another one that played out 50 years ago in our country. 50 years ago, this summer, the Supreme Court handed down a landmark decision in the case of Miranda versus Arizona, in which the court ruled that before law enforcement officers interrogate a suspect, they must advise that person of his or her constitutional rights. And if you've ever watched a cop show, you practically know it by heart. And today, this is a very important feature of the American justice system. It ensures that the poor have the same rights as those who are affluent and those with power. And it helps reduce the likelihood of innocent people being pressured to sign false confessions. But let me tell you what they said in the summer of 1966. A few weeks after Miranda, the New York Times wrote a headline, "Miranda decision said to end effective use of confessions." Direct headline, New York Times. The article quoted some of the most respected prosecutors in the country, warning the decision was a catastrophe. Richard Nixon called the ruling let's say, befitting Charles Dickens, that would hamstrung law enforcement, and he even suggested the Constitution should be amended to overturn it. The sky didn't fall. Certainly, the debate should include the fact that the national murder rate and burglary rate are now lower than they were the day the Miranda ruling was handed down, and it's a cornerstone of American due process. So just as the justice system adapted to Miranda, I believe law enforcement and intelligence officials are going to have to adapt to strong encryption. They suggest that strong encryption on smartphones will mean that everybody's walking around with a Swiss bank account in their pocket. I would say in response that if you want to take a look at a criminal suspect's bank records, maybe you could start by serving a warrant on their bank. Even the Swiss banks are pretty much doing that today. So we're really talking radical stuff here today, huh? The fact of the matter is that government agencies are going to continue to be able to gather information on suspects, even with the spread of strong encryption. If the government has evidence that you are up to something nefarious, they're going to go to your bank, they're going to go to your employer, they're going to go to all sorts of companies you can do business with, including communications companies. Lots of communications companies are going to retain the ability to decrypt customers' communications in order to provide services like password recovery, antivirus scanning, or to show your ads so that they can make their products free to use. Even communications companies that recognize the security risk to their customers of retaining the data will still have enormous amounts of unencrypted metadata, like the address of the sender and the recipient, which are going to offer enormous surveillance opportunities that didn't exist 15 years ago and are not going away anytime soon. Now, the last point I want to make before I kind of lay out where I think we need to go is that recently a publication came out called Don't Panic. And those that were involved in writing it were a former Assistant Secretary of Defense, a former Assistant Attorney General, the former Director of the National Counterterrorism Center. And it was their view, and it was why they chose that title, Don't Panic, that in a world with all of these sensors and connectivity, that this idea that we were all going dark just was not in line with the facts. And the Intelligence Committee doesn't have very many open hearings. But over a month ago, I asked the head of the National Intelligence Committee, James Clapper, to give a public review of Don't Panic. And we ought to have that in a few weeks. And my hope is that it will highlight, again, the importance of strong encryption. And I know that people say that they aren't afraid of the government having their information or listening in on Amazon Echo because they don't have anything to hide. And I think it's great to have that faith in government. But it wasn't all that long ago that J. Edgar Hoover was FBI director. He amassed information about the private lives of politicians and civil rights leaders, and Hoover used that information to intimidate and harass anyone he viewed as a threat, including Martin Luther King Jr. Can you imagine J. Edgar Hoover with all of the information technology that is available today? For me, when I think about that, I try to imagine what political or social movements might you never have heard of and benefited from because someone like J. Edgar Hoover was able to use the power of information technology to bring them down. There is a very real cost to society when everybody knows their most personal thoughts and conversations. There's a chilling effect, a self-editing of potentially controversial or uncontroversial statements. Some of my email conversations are a lot less colorful than when I talk to somebody face to face. But I think it's fair to say, with universal surveillance, that bleaching of thought and language that can reach our most private conversations, that's what more and more people use as a judgment with respect to what they're going to put online. So I'm going to close by describing a few short steps about what we can do to protect our rights at this unique time, where essentially all of the limits are off, all of the limits that we had for centuries past. And I'm calling it a new compact for security and liberty in the digital age. And I always say I'm always welcome to having things renamed. First, we've got to end the campaign against strong encryption. Encryption is one of the best defenses an individual has to protect himself or herself in the digital world. Without encryption, the technologies we live with would enable thieves to take not only our wallets and our purses, but our entire life savings in the blink of an eye. Without encryption, connected technologies could be perverted to plan home invasions, abductions, and worse. Baby monitors and Wi-Fi enabled dolls have already been hacked. Cars have been hacked. Personal photos of the rich and famous have been hacked. Health records and credit cards and millions of sensitive government documents have been hacked, including perhaps some of you have joined me when you learned from the OPM that your records, were hacked. Without encryption, the most personal affairs of every person, who they spend time with, where they go, what they think could be laid bare, despite the best efforts to keep that information private. Even with encryption, poor implementation and carelessness can leave an individual exposed, but encryption at least gives our people a fighting chance at maintaining a real measure of digital security in the modern world. So I wrote a bill back in 2014, seems like eons ago, a simpler time, called the Secure Data Act. And the Secure Data Act is really simple. It says the government can't require companies to weaken the security of their products. The Justice Department is trying to claim that the government has that power today. That's why the bill is so important. The bill directly pushes back and bars the Justice Department from having the claim, being able to justify the claim that they make today that they have this power. They dropped a high-profile case this week, but let me tell you, as sure as the night follows the day, this is coming back. The fact they dropped it this week means that we can just sort of stay tuned. And number one, I hope all of you will help us pass the Secure Data Act. Number two, we've got to strengthen the protections for the information individuals share with private companies. I'll propose now that one of our core principles should be that individuals do not lose their privacy rights because they share some of their personal information with a particular company. Most Americans now have relationships with a broad range of companies that store bits of personal information about them. It's a key feature of the digital economy. Consumers consent to share information with individual companies, and those companies tell their consumers how their data will be handled. If a company violates the privacy rules with respect to terms of service, it can lose business and even end up in court. As long as this whole process is sufficiently transparent to consumers, the market will give people the privacy that they demand. Here is the problem. A few decades ago, courts began ruling that if you provided information to a third party, bank, phone company, something like that, you're no longer keeping it private and it's no longer protected by the Fourth Amendment. There is a huge flaw in that logic. When you share your information with a single private company, that's not the same thing as making it public, folks. Just not. Your phone company may have records of who you call, and your bank may have records of how you spend your money, but your contract with them will have rules for how and when they're allowed to share it. They aren't allowed to just give it out, indiscriminately. And that's true in the digital world as well. If I were to leave today and post a handsome new profile picture on Facebook, or send a tweet to tell people that I'm holding a town hall in Oregon, I made the choice to make that information public. But when you send an email to your spouse or store a document in the cloud so you can work on it later, my service provider and I have an agreement that that's going to stay private. The premise in current law that I've agreed to make that information public because my service provider is holding it is absurd, it is wrong, and it needs to be changed. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor agrees with us. And again, the justices are getting it right. And she basically said that she would not assume that all information voluntarily disclosed to somebody for a limited business purpose has lost its Fourth Amendment protection. That's the core of what she has said on that point. And I hope as part of this strategy that I'm laying out today that we're going to have to push back against the status quo, that people would recognize that when people provide information to a company with an agreement that the information not be made public, those people are not waiving their privacy rights in America. Third, on the new compact, the Congress should adopt and announce a schedule to hold more open hearings to examine the privacy impacts of surveillance laws, authorities, and practices. Right now, if you serve on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, you might get a half hour a year to ask questions in open session about the topics we're talking about today. My staff is in the room. John Dickus, some of you, where's John? John Raisin. That young man spent 6 months preparing to ask the question I asked James Clapper. I asked James Clapper whether the government held any type of data at all on millions of Americans. And you all know what he said, and you all know why it wasn't true. John Dickus spent 6 months working to ask that question. We get 15 minutes a year, 15 minutes, half an hour a year to ask questions. We've got to have real transparency and open discussions to bring the American people in the debate. The moves I have proposed for a schedule, the adoption and schedule of more open hearings to look at the privacy aspects of surveillance law, these are reforms that are long overdue. Fourth, defenders of digital rights have to be on the alert for attempts to undermine the rights when nobody is really looking. An example that I would give you is the Justice Department is now seeking a change to Federal Rule 41 of criminal procedure. And this involves how agents get warrants to track computer hackers. Specifically, they're asking to use a single warrant to remotely access any computer that a suspected hacker is believed to have broken into. This rule change could potentially allow federal investigators to use just one warrant to access millions of computers And it basically treats the victims of the hack the same as the hacker themselves. The rule change would go into effect later this year unless people like us get serious about blocking it. And that's one of the reasons I'm here today, is to ask you to join me in that. Finally, I think it's important to recognize that advances in technology create legitimate challenges for our intelligence and law enforcement officials. I also think it's possible for them to adapt and develop new investigative methods without basically chucking our freedoms into a trash can. Now, I don't know if the FBI is here today. I don't know if they're listening to this. But here's what I know for sure. They ought to be hiring more people like those in this room and others who share the values that have brought together RightsCon. Now, we can win this fight for security and liberty. And I'm going to close by saying, I know it's not going to be easy, but we have done it before. And I'm looking around the room, and I'm seeing some familiar faces who probably remember January of 2012, when we were talking about the PIPA and SOPA bills. Some of you remember that? The anti-internet PIPA and SOPA bills. And back in January of 2012, the first vote in the whole debate was going to be on whether or not to override my hold on the bill, the Senate version. There's a version in the Senate and the House. And this discussion had been going on, and there were 44 United States senators, folks, that were co-sponsoring the bill that I had a public hold on. And for months, there was discussion in the Congress, well, they're going to vote on it, they're going to get 80 votes. Everybody knows Ron, he's from Oregon, that kind of thing. And I was telling my colleagues, there are people all over this country that are spending a lot more time thinking about SOPA and PIPA in a week or 10 days than they do thinking about their senators in 2 years. And when they know what this bill really entails, they are not going to be happy. And they are going to tell us about it. And a few days before the vote, more than 10 million Americans weighed in. Calls and letters and emails. And the vote was going to be on a Monday. All of that took place. You might remember the websites going dark and citizens laying out what it meant. And about 36 hours after this began, I got a call, and I was told there wasn't going to be a vote to override my hold on PIPA and SOPA. So when the dust settles, everybody now knows it can be done. Those who believe Gesundheit, those who believe in a free and open internet, those who want an encryption, do we got allergies here? Those who want a free and open internet and an encryption policy that ensures we have more security rather than less security. I want to ask you, as the community did when it came together back in 2012 to fight PIPA and SOPA, I want to ask you to join me in working together once again to make sure that a free and open internet and policies that guarantee security and liberty are the policies that are the law of the land. We did it once. Let's do it again. Thank you.
Well, Senator, thank you very much. To be continued. For people who are not American in this room, I think it's really important that you understand the significance of Senator Wyden in the US Congress. You can imagine who his opponents are. He is a very brave man who stood up as an ally of people who are advocating for a free and open internet, despite unbelievable pressure from all of the three-letter agencies, and he's continuing to, as you can see, he hasn't quieted down at all. So let's bring on the panel. I'm sorry it's a little bit of a patchwork, but Frank LaRue, please come join us. And anywhere you like, it's fine. And Uri, who is the Cyber Czar and former Foreign Minister of Holland, is also joining us. And Sally Costerden from ICANN, who's the Senior Vice President for Stakeholder Engagement. Please take a seat. And we've also invited Javier to join as well, who is the Senior Policy Analyst from Access Now from Latin America. I hope you can hop up on those seats. I think they're quite stable. And I should also announce there's going to be a swap out as well. Yeah, if you could pass the mics, that would be great. Because the foreign minister needs to catch a plane. So this session will go on for 30 minutes or a little bit longer. I hope you don't mind if we take a bit of time into your break. If people need to leave, of course, they should. So the title of this panel is actually Whoever Controls the Future of the Internet Controls the Future of the World. There is a Slido thing here, but I haven't quite mastered that technology. Do we want to get a sense in the room of who agrees with that statement? Whoever controls the future of the Internet controls the future of the world? All right, so let's see what happens at the end of this session. I might pass over directly to Uri. And I mean, my introduction is really to say that over the last couple of years, we have seen what has been a somewhat kind of niche issue in terms of internet governance has now become very central. I mean, we've seen the role that the US Congress is playing in terms of its management of the internet. But institutions like the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, the General Assembly of the United Nations, ICANN, are all and companies as well, are all positioning. We're starting to see world leaders have at their most senior level in terms of their geopolitical and bilateral relations, questions of internet governance and who controls and manages the internet space. And this panel is designed to look at, like, where does this growing interest come from? Are these efforts actually made in good faith? And do they aim to protect the internet users, or are we actually just seeing a global geopolitical fight happen in the online space? So with that, let me hand over to the Foreign Minister. And I ask you, as somebody who's played a very central role in these debates, a couple of months ago, Access Now had the honor of being invited to speak at the General Assembly on the future of the internet. We actually crowdsourced our speech. We had over 1,000 people write our speech, and our youngest team member, Deniz from Istanbul, presented to the General Assembly, and Yuri was there as the representative of the Dutch government in that WISIS process. Over to you.
Thank you very much for this introduction, and let me be very brief because I have to catch the plane, and as a former politician I'm used to a tight schedule, 3 minutes or so, and I will try my best. Let me first say, actually, I'm here on US ground, and for that matter, it's just interesting enough that already in 1755, ladies and gentlemen, Benjamin Franklin wrote literally, "Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety." And let me add to that, ladies and gentlemen, that he had a prospective mind, because he wrote it in exactly 140 characters. So there you go. Now, that having been said, let me make a very short second statement, and that is on what Senator Wyden was, of course, talking about. When we talk about encryption, let me say, on behalf of the Dutch government, the following, that our government is of the opinion, I stated literally, that at this time it's not desirable to limit the development, availability, and use of encryption, to limit the development, availability, and use of encryption in the Netherlands. And this conclusion and the considerations that led up to it are to be expressed internationally. And that's what I'm here for. So there you go. You have your supporters on that. And then a third statement, and that is actually the following. When we talk about internet, and you know that the Netherlands are very heavy in internet, and that our internet exchange is the largest one in the world today, we are, of course, thinking about who owns the internet. And in a way, the answer is simple. The internet is of us all. And the internet is a common good, and it belongs to the public space. And for that matter, let me be concrete about it to you. The Netherlands, the Dutch government, is now in process of launching an initiative to actually get to the core and the heart of the matter. And that is that we are talking about ways in which we can get a sort of consensus, and I will admit, but rather later than sooner, unfortunately, a sort of consensus on the fact that the so-called internet backbone, as the public core of the internet, should be safeguarded from intervention, intrusions, and what have you. And when we talk about the core of the internet, the backbone of the internet, we talk about the protocols, the standards, and of course also the undersea cables that run it as a public good that needs indeed protection. And this protection should be a matter and a responsibility of us all, of the multi-stakeholders involved. And for that matter, the Dutch government is launching an initiative to get to what we call a global commission on the stability of cyberspace. And you can compare it in a way when we talk about this public core of the internet that should be safeguarded from whatever infringements, both from governments and from private companies and what have you. You could compare it, for instance, to the Cyber Green Initiative that proposes to speak about the internet in terms of public health. So what we are stressing is the public good we are talking about. And that is what it is all about. And when we then see what it all means, it means that what really is at stake is the security of people to exercise their individual freedoms, which run from free expression to free association to the freedom of assembly and of course to privacy. Well, those were my 3 minutes, sir. And it's too bad that I can't join you in the discussion, but Simone Haling, who is from our ministry, from our government, will definitely be willing to share here the Q&A session which will follow.
Well, actually, let's throw to Q&A before you have to leave us, because I mean to have a senator and then a representative of a Dutch government to speak so progressively about the open internet and so firmly, particularly in the age of terrorism and counterterrorism and the context in which the Dutch government is operating, to stand so strongly and say that it is not the Dutch government's intention to weaken encryption when all of the colleague countries, or many of them, are proposing legislation that would do exactly that. Let's open up for a question or a comment before he has to leave, and Simon will replace. No? Okay.
In any case, I may conclude for myself, and it's a pleasant idea going for 9 hours into the plane that there is a silent consensus on this. So thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Simon, would you like to join us? So, Frank, perhaps you'd like to respond. For people who don't know Frank, he is the former UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression. I have to say this, that when I saw Frank speak in Sweden, in Stockholm, impromptu, he actually gave the best speech I've ever seen in my life. I was sitting there looking at him and I was thinking, you are my absolute hero. Not to put you under any pressure, but it would be great to hear from you, thinking more broadly about perhaps this issue of encryption, but also about the issue of control. Yes. And also, perhaps we could get the lectern taken off the stage if somebody's. That'd be great. Thank you.
Let me begin by the second question. Thanks you, Brett, and a real honor to be here in such a great panel and in this whole event. I'm very, very pleased. Let me begin by the second one. Who has the ownership of internet? And the minister already said that, but I think it's worth emphasizing. Internet belongs to everyone, and it is a service to everyone, and it is part of the public space in which we all relate, and we all communicate and interact. And this is very important to re-emphasize it, because oftentimes many people forget about it. It is true that there are corporations developing the new software and technologies and apps. There are corporations that establish service platforms and are doing it worldwide, and they have it for commercial interest, which is legitimate for that. But it's also true that many governments are trying to regulate it, some honestly with an open mind, others with a more restrictive approach because they're worried about the transparency that it brings with it, and they're worried about investigative journalism, and they're worried about the fact that everyone will get to know whatever's happening around the world or in their own country, in their own government circles. So there's an effort to have more and more restrictive policies with many excuses. Some excuses are national security, others are protection of certain sectors of society, including children. Other excuses are anti-terrorism, or other excuses are religious intolerance in many countries. But whatever the excuse, there are a certain trend for censorship and restriction. But in reality, even if you have different actors participating, the most important element of internet is still society, is still the users. And this is what gives it life. This is why it exists. And this is what actually makes corporations invest in this. This is what generates the huge social networks, but this is also what challenges democratic participation and information in a new way in this 21st century. So I think we have to really rethink the internet as something that belongs to all. And this is why we have to have a multi-stakeholder approach on all the determination of policies of the internet. In UNESCO, after the Connecting the Dots conference, we talked about the 4 basic principles to be applied to internet. One, the roam principles, we call it, as roaming. Number 1 is the rights-oriented approach. Internet is fundamentally an exercise of rights. It's the exercise of freedom of expression, access to information, the exercise of privacy, the exercise of freedom of association, the freedom of assembly when people convene themselves, of freedom of religion when they express their views, or the scientific research or education. All the rights can be exercised through internet. And it has to have this rights-oriented approach. Secondly, internet has to be open and neutral, that to satisfy this public space that we all need to use equally. Third, we have to guarantee accessibility. The danger we run is that internet becomes indirectly part of the digital divide with a privileged minority of people around the world. That may not be valid for developed nations, but it is very valid for developing nations where internet is still not reaching the rural areas or the poorer sectors of the population. And finally, the M is for the multi-stakeholder dialogue. Everything in internet, all the policies have to be decided. In this conference, I have been meeting with several groups, and it's interesting that besides the IGF that we have as an experience around the world, or some experience that we all know, like the CGI.br of Brazil, many countries are beginning, by the initiative of civil society, to establish their own national commission for multi-stakeholder dialogue on internet in an informal way, but progressively formalizing that, including government officials that may not be so sympathetic to the idea at the beginning, but that eventually are being moved to that. So this is the approach. Let me finish this by saying that in the Sustainable Development Goals, we were all very happy to see in Goal 1610, way down there at the end in the corner, where on the need for having societies with equal access to justice, governability. There was also in paragraph 10 established the public access to information. Well, one of the determinations we're doing in UNESCO is how to make access to information and communication a transversal element of all 17 goals. Today, development is not possible without internet. And this is the final appropriation of internet. Internet is for everyone, but especially for those in need to develop their countries and to enhance development, because that is where internet will play a bigger role. And finally, on the encryption, in 2 words, I think was in my 2 predecessors, there was very little left to say, but the 2 issues we have emphasized even today in this conference is that between rights, you cannot have contradiction. You don't balance rights either, because that sounds like a commercial issue of balancing interest and cost and benefits. No. All rights are interrelated, and all rights are complementary and support each other. And some rights may have limitations, yes, and we will have to limit one right to guarantee the exercise of other rights. But that's not a balancing act. That is the interrelationship, the interaction of rights. And therefore, security, which is linked at a state level to the protection of life and the protection of all the other rights, is also linked to the exercise of privacy, and is also linked to the exercise of freedom of expression. I was very pleased to see the senator say, and this I said in one of my reports as rapporteur, the safest societies are those that are more democratic, because it's their own population that protect the society, because they feel it is part of their interest to speak out and to participate and defend their democratic model. But these are societies where people feel free to express themselves, to dissent, to comment, to criticize public officials if they want to. So any form of limitation, either of freedom of expression, of access to information, or to the privacy in which people handle their own data and their own information, will weaken security. So security cannot be used as an excuse. If we want safer nations, we must have more private, more secure, more free, and more democratic countries.
That is the case, or that's the desired case. But at the same time, we're actually seeing the opposite. And I think many of us in this room are constantly on a daily basis fighting legislative developments that are being created by politicians and legislators and heads of security agencies in bilateral and domestic environments that actually are counter to that. There is a rash of cybercrime legislation. There is the militarization of the internet. There is the concentration of power in corporations. And so I think part of our battle is like, how do we ensure that in the context of the human rights framework and the international system and the multi-stakeholder environment, how do we actually assert the rights of the user and the rights of and the human rights of individuals? Because on a daily basis, and I think, you know, Javi, who's sitting next to me, who's been dealing with exactly these issues, you know, in the 20 or 30 countries of Latin America, and it's like there's almost a copy-paste job that's on cybercrime bills, etc. So maybe just jump to Javi and then we'll speak to Sally, because Sally's doing some very, very interesting work in terms of the numbering and naming of the internet and looking at who actually controls that. And that process is fascinating as well.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. Yeah, in that sense, I could say probably that I couldn't agree more with Frank about the immense value that users bring to the internet, right? So it is quite common to think and to have this idea that the internet belongs to users. But that is true that sometimes the backlash comes from that want to regain control. Governments that want to regain the control that they have over certain specific resources. So that's why we see a proliferation, as Brett said, of legislation is always trying to get a hold on critical internet resources. One of the cases that we bring up is cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is like a big thing now. Everyone is trying to protect what they're called the critical resources of the internet. For instance, the domain names, the critical servers that provide, for instance, public services to their populations and stuff like that. And in that case, sometimes the measures towards cybersecurity are oriented in a military way, because in most of the countries, especially in Latin America, it is the military, the people who are putting together the cybersecurity plans, and most of them are closed, quite secretive, and there's not a lot of engagement for civil society. Actually, right now there are some events happening in Washington, and several Latin American organizations, including the Access Now branch in Latin America, are supporting a movement that several organizations are trying to bring to these discussions in the OAS about cybersecurity, to open the dialogue so civil society can participate there. Because there are a lot of risks for fundamental rights, especially for privacy, in some of those military approach to cybersecurity solutions, right? For instance, in the preventive monitoring of networks, just to see where there's some kind of traffic that can probably indicate an imminent cyber attack. When in that case, if you don't have a really specific set of rules and practices that protect the privacy of users, you risk to surveil traffic, right, by doing that. That's just one of the many concerns that you have there. So I would say that probably the shift towards the cybersecurity wars, maybe if you can put it like that, is really, really interesting, because you have these immense statistics about the attacks going from China to other places, and I say China because there's a lot of proxy servers that are located in China. So a lot of people say, hey, this attack came from China, but we're not really sure because there's a lot of proxies used there, to hop the traffic. So I would say that the participation of the very same public and the same population that are the most important parts of the internet, which is the final users, is fundamental for us to try to coordinate policies in a right-respecting way.
So I mean, that's what many of the civil society organizations, of which there are actually a very limited number when you think about the kind of groups globally that are facing bills that are passing, coming to parliaments, coming to congresses, at first or second reading speech, and suddenly we have to rally around to even get a seat at the table to be able to speak. But there is also institutionalized multi-stakeholderism, and I think that ICANN has attempted to provide a framework that brings together governments and civil society and companies into the room at this critical infrastructure point. As many people here would know, ICANN currently has a contractual arrangement with the Department of Commerce, and Sally can talk to this more, but we're in the process of transition. There is a process of transitioning. And this is a really interesting and fundamental point in the history and development of the internet. So over to Sally.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you very much for inviting us to be part of this, and thank you all for coming. It's great to see such a full room. Is there anybody in here who doesn't know what ICANN does? Everybody knows. One person, two people. Okay. So just because I wander around assuming everybody knows, and some people always don't know, ICANN stands for the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. So ICANN is a private sector-led, bottom-up, multi-stakeholder organization that manages internet resources for the public. for the public good. It is increasingly global in nature. Its overall responsibilities are to coordinate to help to coordinate a set of unique identifiers, which are the logical layer of the internet that allow you to effectively see the web the way that you do, essentially, in sort of layman's terms. And just because people always ask us this question, some of you have this in front of you, and do you have access to it. We'll tweet the link to it on the RightsCon hashtag after this, if anybody would like to download it. And what you can see here is ICANN is here in the orange layer, the logical layer. And this is where that technical coordination is going on of the identifiers. Underneath it, as my Dutch colleague was saying before he left, is the technical infrastructure that is, in a way, ties together the actual delivery of the internet as we know it. And the reason why we're all here having this conversation, the reason why people want to control it is everything up here in the blue layer. These are all what we call the content layer, if you like, the societal, economic layer of what's on the internet. And this is the piece where we're discussing all the issues that are relevant to this panel and many others. Because of the unique relationship that ICANN as an organization has always had with the US government, it was in fact spun out 15 years ago from the Department of Commerce in order to run something called the IANA function, I-A-N-A. And you'll see that on the back of this. There's a little bit more detail here and tells you a bit more about it. IANA is a set of functions that are housed and operated within ICANN, and it acts as the top-level allocator for blocks of IP addresses. Now, it's very administrative. It's really a database function. But around the world, many organizations, governments, and groups have believed that this is a special relationship that goes far beyond that, to the point where I have sat on panels and been accused of being a department of the CIA, the NSA, that we, as ICANN, are be asked by the US government to kick countries out of the root zone, out of the internet, and pretty much anything else you care to think of. That's one thing. So power and control for us is a lot about what is it that we control, what are our responsibilities, and they are about coordinating those identifiers in the public interest, exactly as Frank says, very important, in the public interest. And we do that, which is what Brett was saying, by having a very active multi-stakeholder process. Anyone can come to ICANN, and by come, you can literally come. We have 3 meetings, a bit like this, every year around the world, with about 2,000 or 3,000 people at each one in person, many more remotely. It's free to come. There are no restrictions. We want everyone who believes that their world and life is affected by what we do to come and have a say. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the policy-making process is done, as you would expect, in a bottom-up, multi-stakeholder way. And all those stakeholders are at ICANN. That is how it is structured. That makes it unusual. I'm not sure it makes it unique, but it's certainly unusual. And the scale it operates is unusual too. The one thing that I think is probably unique about ICANN is the presence of governments at ICANN. And one of our committees is called the Government Advisory Committee, or the GAC. We love our acronyms at ICANN. I'm sorry about that. And that group has currently 170 governments sitting on it. And they operate through consensus, which is no material objection. And the most recent manifestation of our multi-stakeholder process has been the creation of a multi-stakeholder bottom-up proposal, which is recommending a transfer of the stewardship of this contract, the IANA oversight contract, away from the US government to the multi-stakeholder community, to the world. What some of you in this room have said to me this week and today, you think it's a historic moment in the history of American foreign policy. This is not my words, these are other people's words. Not one I've heard before, fascinating. It's certainly historic from an internet governance perspective in terms of thinking about the future of how we manage these kinds of resources and the kind of accountability and trust that we put in place. And the Senator talked about the need for transparency. This has been a very, very incredibly important part of the process. And the final comment I would make is that Some of us in the room are digital natives, young people for whom the internet is always been there. Some of us are not. And for those of us who are not, and I can just speak for myself here, maybe I'm the only one, learning how to do this together, to build consensus through multi-stakeholder agreements, the give and take that is required in order to get through this process has been a phenomenal thing to watch. I honestly never thought, in some ways it seemed almost impossible. I'm not sure we ever believed we could get there, but we submitted the proposal as a community to the NTIA, to the Department of Commerce, 3 weeks ago. So fingers crossed, there's more stages to go, but we're nearly there. So do come and have a say, and I hope that if anybody's interested, I'm happy to take questions here or afterwards, and thank you very much for inviting us.
So I think that, you know, there are obviously internet governance heads in this room, but there are also people who aren't. And to understand the geopolitical processes that have gone on to get to this point where that central functioning of the internet is actually being moved from ultimately from US government control to an international multi-stakeholder space is, I think, really underknown, certainly, and there is an opportunity to participate. The question I have for you is, when is it going to happen and how much longer do we have to wait, Sally?
That's a great question, Brett. So the process answer to that is that the US, there's a final stage of bylaw drafting, which will happen very quickly in the next few weeks. The Department of Commerce, Larry Strickling, then at the NTIA, now will put the proposal through some external internet governance of academic filter, then through an interagency, examination within the US government so that everybody is on the same page, and then finally a period of examination by Congress. So that will take about another, we hope, fingers crossed, and it's not up to ICANN now, but the contract in its current form elapses at the end of September this year. So we travel and hope that things will come together in that time frame. That's our current understanding, but it's in the hands of the Department of Commerce now.
And the Congress, of which the senator is a representative of, there are many people within that Congress who are opposed to this transition because they see the transition of the control of ICANN away from the US is the US giving up control of the internet. And I think we're in for a bit of a battle there. Simone, welcome to the panel. I think we're probably close to an end. People also look a little tired as well. I just got a yawn over there. But any reflections upon the comments that have been made here as a representative of a government? Somebody who has been very active in co-developing policy for the Dutch government, including the encryption policy, and thank you very much for that. Very much appreciated. Any reflections upon this issue of control? Is it state-based? Is it citizen-based? Is it intergovernmental? Where should it lie in the multi-stakeholder environment?
Well, to be honest, I think that the issues that we're talking about and the complexities that we have to tackle are not on isolated phases, but they're just like in every aspect, pretty much, of our policy making.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I think it's working now. So I think I think one of the biggest complexities of looking at this issue is that we can't sort of isolate it in any way, but that on every topic that we're talking about, this comes back. And what I now take from the panel is that whether it is on internet governance or whether it's on cybersecurity policy making, we need a user-centric approach. So all people involved need to take human rights into consideration, and we need to have a multi-stakeholder approach to make sure that we have different views contributing to the debate. And I think only if we accomplish that approach, it will be possible to break through policy silos, to actually have conversations that take fully into consideration the complexity of the issues that we're talking about. And I think, speaking as a government representative, there is a huge responsibility here for governments to do at least two things: to create best practice, and I think what that requires is to, within governments, also break through policy silos, and to give then sort of a best practice, I think, with the encryption position that we developed. I think one of the reasons that we came to this position was that we had a cross-ministerial working group where almost all the ministries were represented, and we actually considered all the relevant interests that were at stake here, weighed them evenly. Everybody got to talk. They are all represented in the position, and only by really having that open and full discussion, we were able to come at this balanced position, I guess.
So I've been in a number of meetings with government officials on cyber policy. And one of the things that I found really interesting is often you have different competing interests within government. So you have the cyber people on one side and often the human rights people on another side. And I've been in meetings where I've sat in the middle where the human rights representative has a very small budget, has a very weak arguments in response to the cyber imperative that's being proposed. And I'm just thinking about control within the national state, within the executive, and the civil servants. And ultimately, it seems as though the cyber guys are winning, you know, and so it's just great to hear that there is actually this inter-ministerial process that gives an opportunity for the balancing and competing interests within government to be able to come to a position that in this instance has delivered something which I think is reflective of the interest and need of the user as opposed to that of the cybersecurity industry in this instance. So look, I think we've run out of time. I know this conversation's kind of gone in various different places, but really appreciate your interest. Let's give a round of applause to the panel, and I'm sure they're all here to talk to you afterwards.